We just went through day 14 of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial. Things did not turn out quite as I had expected. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. So in day 14, we saw the cross-examination and redirect of Amber Heard's expert witness, Dr. Dawn Hughes, before we saw Amber Heard herself take the witness stand. And before I talk anymore, let me give a little bit of a trigger warning. I know a lot of people that are interested in this case are often survivors of DV and SA. And even though in my recaps I try to pare down the salacious language of what comes up at trial, there's always the possibility that the nature of what we're talking about can be triggering. So please do be mindful of that as we proceed in case that pertains to you. Okay, if you watched day 13's recap, you know I predicted that day 14 would probably be a disco bloodbath as Dr. Hughes was cross-examined and torn to shreds by the Depp legal team. And unfortunately, I was pretty much wrong about that. Now, that's not to say that Johnny will lose his case because of what happened in this cross-examination. I'm not saying that at all. And undoubtedly, there were some points scored from which Johnny's team can argue in their closing arguments. And arguably, that is the most important aspect here of a cross-examination to their case, much more important than scoring a total takedown of an expert witness. That said, it would have been pretty satisfying to see, in my opinion. But anyway, I also want to point out that it is 100% possible that there is information that I don't have analyzing this lawsuit, that the Depp legal team does have that can enable them to make strategic decisions that I wouldn't have necessarily thought to do. As we know, Dr. Curry is subject to recall as a rebuttal witness, so she could very well play an important role in terms of a mic drop moment of sorts at the very end of the trial to nail some points for the jury right before closing arguments. And like I've said before, I am one lawyer talking to you through a box on the internet, and my way is not necessarily the way. That said, I do think that there was some really great opportunity that could have been explored a little bit more on cross-examination that was not. And I do wish that Mr. Dennison, Johnny's attorney, who did the cross-examination, had maintained better control of Dr. Hughes throughout this cross-examination. But here's some of the things that Dr. Dennison did draw out. Oh, hello. He did point out the very gendered language that Dr. Hughes was using to describe victims as female and abusers as male. And although he tried to pin her down as never having testified for a male victim before, she responded that she in fact had testified for several male victims in her past. She then listed some of those circumstances, and they were all seemingly same-sex situations. Although the jury might have noticed this, I wish she would have flagged it further by asking something like, "But you've never testified on behalf of a male victim in a heterosexual relationship, have you?" Because by all appearances, this is the case. And it would highlight that in these kinds of heterosexual relationships, she's operating with a certain bias against male survivors suffering at the hands of female abusers. He also asked a line of questions to point out that despite her language in her direct examination that seemed to indicate that Amber's accusations were true, Dr. Hughes wasn't there when all of that stuff allegedly happened. So of course, she couldn't say one way or another whether those things did in fact happen as Amber alleged to her. One of the big points that he did score here, though, was by putting in front of Dr. Hughes a photo of the knife that Amber gifted Johnny during their relationship. I really hope that I included this in a previous recap from Johnny's testimony because the knife really stuck out to me and pretty much everyone on the panel as a very odd gift from someone who is supposedly afraid for her life by her alleged abuser. Honestly, if Amber was afraid of Johnny, why give him a very large, sharp knife? And what's more, Dr. Dennison pointed out the inscription that she had engraved into the knife, which Dr. Hughes said was hasta la muerte, or Spanish for until death. It was great placement to ask Dr. Hughes if she had considered the existence of this gift, and if so, what effect it had on her assessment that Amber was an abused woman afraid for her life during their relationship. Anyway, Mr. Dennison also pointed out a bunch of notes from Dr. Hughes' file diagnosing Amber's PTSD and ruling out borderline and histrionic personality disorders. As Mr. Dennison went through it, he pointed out a number of deficiencies in her note-keeping, which was particularly interesting considering Dr. Hughes was seen only in the course of litigation. In other words, Dr. Hughes knew that her visits with Amber were likely to end up with her notes read in court. So it's weird that she'd be so I don't know, seemingly lazy about filling out these kinds of details. One of the points in particular came from her testimony saying that Amber has PTSD. Specifically, Dr. Hughes said that PTSD has to come from a specific event. And yet, in her diagnostic notes, where she determines that Amber does have PTSD, she lists as Amber's triggering event, quote unquote, IPV by Johnny, with IPV meaning intimate partner violence. Given what she had testified about the specificity of the triggering event, this is much more generic than what I would expect from someone insisting that it comes from, like I said, a specific event. Another point that was made by Mr. Dennison was Dr. Hughes' listing of Amber's intimate relationships, quote unquote. There, Dr. Hughes listed James Franco and Elon Musk. Although Dr. Hughes tried to distinguish that she didn't label them as romantic relationships, Mr. Dennison quipped back that Dr. Hughes also didn't provide a header labeling them as friends either, and he pointed out other past romantic relationships that were right there on that same page. This was interesting, although here and elsewhere, I wish Mr. Dennison would have pressed a little bit harder on the fact that Dr. Hughes' opinions rely heavily on the self reporting of Amber and how self reporting can be manipulated, especially where the examined person anticipates the results of the test to be used at trial and where she's even sat for multiple self reporting style tests. I also really wish that he had taken up a line of questions to explore various incidents as we understand them from Johnny's perspective and to ask with each instance whether Dr. Hughes' opinion would change if essentially she were given Johnny's facts instead. The reason that I think this would be effective is because it could strongly point out either the incompleteness of Dr. Hughes' analysis of this whole situation or the rigidity of the same upon new information. And that could end up pointing to whether she was looking at data to form a conclusion or looking at a conclusion and then fitting data into it. Okay, so that was Dr. Hughes. Then we saw Amber Heard herself take the stand. On the panel, we spent quite a bit of time discussing whether we thought Amber's performance came across as sincere. For the most part, people seemed to think that it was inauthentic, but that definitely wasn't true across the board. For me, I think that she started off pretty authentic and charismatic, at least seemingly. But once she started to get into some of the more dramatic or salacious incidents in their relationship, the speed of her emotional range for me was a little bit jarring. I couldn't help but hear her voice from the Tell the World Johnny recordings and to compare it to what I was seeing on the stand. What's more, when an objection would come out from Johnny's legal team in the middle of Amber's very emotional account, her face would drop suddenly out of the feeling conveying her point in the story. And then when she resumed her testimony, she would recover quickly to her prior emotional state. Hi. It felt odd since emotions usually don't operate authentically by an on off switch. They seem to come more in waves than anything else, which means that its ascent and descent will operate a bit more like the tide rolling in and out. So, this sudden shift to on and off to me felt very synthetic. Anyway, as for the substantive content of her direct examination so far, she talked a bit about her childhood, but she didn't really spend too much time talking about it. She talked quite a bit about meeting Johnny through the production of Rum Diary and characterized it as a very unequal kind of relationship in the beginning, especially as she was a no-name actor and he was a big international celebrity. Then she had a line of testimony where she described being in his trailer in her stage robe to bring him a bottle of wine as a gift. To me, this was a little bit of a strange scene as she described it because it felt like she was trying to pull together a particular Me Too narrative about the quote unquote girl getting creeped out by a creepy McCreeperson and trying to just laugh it off uncomfortably until she's safely out of there. Specifically, she testified that he kind of kicked up the back of her robe with his foot and ended up using his body to put her down on the bed and to say something to the effect of, yum. And then she said she tried to laugh it off in her discomfort. The problem with this was for me personally, as a woman who has found myself in situations where I wanted to be agreeable, so I felt the need to laugh off discomfort. Those are situations where I'm not going to end up dating that person because the discomfort indicates something about the fact that I'm not exactly feeling it. And now, maybe that's just me, or maybe this is something that's a little bit more universal across the board for women, but this was just something that stuck out to me personally that really got a flag going. And it really just seemed strange for her to describe the situation in this way and then to later describe how they absolutely fell madly in love head over heels 100%. Anyway, she described what she characterized as Johnny's early ghosting behavior, as well as control over her career and her dress out in public, and a lot of lavish gifts that he presented her with. And then eventually she got into to some of her first allegations of violence by Johnny, which she said started in 2013. For example, she described what Johnny also talked about earlier, which was the quote unquote tattoo incident, where she said his Wino Forever tattoo made her laugh, and where in response, according to Amber's testimony today, Johnny smacked her hard enough that she fell to the floor and analyzed the quote unquote dirty carpet. Amber also described another incident from 2013 where she said Johnny accused her of cheating with multiple people and as a result ended up backhanding her face with his very ringed hand. She testified that as a result of the impact, she could feel her teeth cut into her lip and see blood spatter onto a wall next to her. Another example of violence that she testified to was an incident where they were out in Joshua Tree with friends to hang out and do psychedelics together. She testified that a female friend had put her hand on Amber's shoulder. And as a result, according to Amber, Johnny basically smacked the other lady's hand away, said something like, "This is my girl," and then threatened the lady by grabbing her wrist and talking about how he could break it. Another oddly similar incident Amber touched on was one where she and Johnny and others were on a flight to Moscow and decided to do MDMA together. Amber testified that Johnny convinced one of the flight attendants to do MDMA with them, and that when she did, she too was alleged to have come on to Amber, upsetting Johnny. After both of these alleged female love interest incidents, Amber alleges that Johnny beat her in private. Although, according to her testimony, they were alone during the beatings, there at least does seem to be a discrepancy between Johnny's take and Amber's take, especially the Joshua Tree incident, which we heard from Johnny talk about as well. But this is why we kind of really need to hear from these other individuals who were involved in this story to corroborate Amber's story. If every person she mentions in her story is either unavailable because they've generally disappeared or because they're passed on like Jerry Judge, that doesn't really say much for the truth and accuracy of Amber's account. But anyway, there's another interesting thing that came up for the panel that I wanted to mention before wrapping this up. Rick Hogue of Hogue Law, shout out to him because he's been spending so much time on these live streams with us, giving his great commentary. Be sure to subscribe to him, linked in the description below. Said that he's been going through this case essentially as a factual newbie, reacting to the facts as they are presented to the jury at trial. And because of that, he's been a particularly interesting barometer for the things that the jury might be thinking. Of course, there's an important distinction being that he is an attorney and the jury is full of lay people who do not necessarily have a lawyer's brain and are not necessarily applying a lawyer's analysis. But besides that distinction, he still is a pretty good barometer here. Anyway, he said in the day 14 live stream that based on everything that he had heard going into this direct examination, he had a hard time believing the things that she was saying. And yet, he said, in a way, he struggled with her testimony at the same time because of the horrid nature of the things that she was alleging. To hopefully accurately paraphrase him, in a way, her lying about these kinds of things seems truly evil. And it's kind of terrifying to have to face and consider the possibility the evil does truly exist and is staring you right in the face. Personally, I could see how a man could have a particularly difficult time wrestling with this because it's like you don't want to assume that a woman making these kinds of accusations is lying. It just kind of hits the gut in a wrong way. But of course, that has to be balanced with the other messages that you're getting from your gut as to whether or not this comes across as sincere. And what's more, I can understand a man thinking that it's even more terrifying to consider someone like Amber lying through her teeth about made up allegations like this because, well, that means that the man could be extremely vulnerable to finding himself in Johnny's seat too. In other words, psychologically speaking, it might just hit too close to home. And this particularly hits my brain considering the fact that of the jurors that are sitting on the panel, 2 are female and the rest are male. And even with that, at this point, not all of them will end up deliberating. At least 2 of them will be alternates that don't make it into the jury room. So we could have a situation where the jury is a jury of completely all males who are battling with these kinds of feelings, much more so than I think a woman would. But anyway, that was it for day 14. In day 15, we're going through more Amber Heard direct examination, and I anticipate this to take up the rest of the day, maybe even into day 16. We will see how this goes, and we'll see what happens when she's eventually cross-examined. But anyway, did you see the testimony? And if so, let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you found this interesting or at least informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. and so you can join us for day 15 of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial, live streamed with legal commentary right here on this channel. See you in the next video.